The Christian Church claims Jesus Christ died on the cross for our sins. He was a victim of crucifixion, one of the most savage executions ever invented by humans.
This is a form of punishment where bones were broken, you were covered in blood, you're suspended, so you're finding it hard to breathe. You are dying in excruciating agony.
But could the story of Jesus dying on the cross be a myth?
Archaeologically speaking, crucifixion might as well have not existed. The evidence is just tiny.
It's perfectly possible that Jesus was not crucified on the cross.
What is the truth? Was Christ really crucified on the cross as the Bible claims? Or is it just a story made up by the church?
If Jesus did not die on the cross, it would mean that he may not be the Son of God.
At the core of Christianity is the crucifixion. The story of Jesus nailed to a cross and left to die. But did this momentous event really happen?
The crucifixion of Christ is probably the most famous, the most portrayed event in human history. It's relayed to us in countless paintings, in movies, in books. I mean, we are told every last thing that happened on that terrible day.
Considered barbaric by today's standards, crucifixion was part execution and part public spectacle.
Crucifixion is an ancient torture technique, most likely begun by the Persians, but it was perfected by the Romans, and it is effectively an impaling technique. It was a gross and humiliating way to die, and that's precisely what the Romans wanted.
When it comes to crucifixion, this was not just a way of getting rid of somebody. It was protracted, it was for the public to witness. Really, it was a circus of death.
Typically, crucifixion victims would die over the course of hours, sometimes even days. And so you almost have to picture the scene, someone naked, battered, bruised, and gasping for breath.
The body's attached to the cross. It's left there hanging. You can only imagine if your legs no longer could support you. Your body would have slumped forward, and this would have caused the lungs to fill up with fluid. You would have suffocated.
Despite the gore depicted in Hollywood films, historians are struggling to distinguish fact from fiction in the real crucifixion story.
A lot of our understanding of crucifixion has been informed by Hollywood, by tradition, and that if you were to simply look at the gospel texts, could you say for sure that Jesus was crucified in the way that a lot of traditional portrayals of the crucifixion depict?
While the church supports all four gospels as factual accounts of Christ's life, many scholars are less convinced.
The official line of the churches is that each of the gospel writers had some connection to Jesus, that they knew him. The evidence for that is vanishingly slight.
The four Gospels just aren't historical documents. They probably weren't written by the people whose names are on them. They were written by communities and teams over time. And they were written much later, generations later.
The Gospels were written between 60 AD and 100 plus AD. We have no conclusive evidence that the Gospels were written by people who had actually stood in Jesus' presence.
Stockholm, Sweden. While hunting for the origin of the crucifixion legend, theologist Gunnar Samuelsson has spent almost 10 years scouring the earliest records of this execution technique.
My research into the crucifixion, it began with reading a book, of course, searching for text about crucifixions.
Gunnar studied every ancient manuscript he could find referencing crucifixion, the oldest of which dates back to the 9th century BC.
It was a painstaking work. I was Indiana Jones. You know, you never know what will be in the next text. I was trying desperately to find information about crucifixions.
After searching through manuscripts in Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and Aramaic, to his shock, Gunnar discovered that these ancient texts didn't describe crucifixion as we understand it today.
I started to realize that in these texts you have a problem.
The problem was that none of the texts mention a cross, which today many consider the key implement of crucifixion.
So when did the symbol of the cross came from?
Turning to a non-biblical text from ancient Greece, Gunnar found a detailed description of the execution technique, but it suggested a cross may not have been used at all.
They only uses this verb, stavron, which means essentially means to suspend, a suspension, a general suspension.
Today, the word crucifixion has become synonymous with the cross. Yet if Gunnar's research is correct, the word evolved from the Greek term stauron, which has no direct link to a shape. Since the New Testament was first written in Greek, this finding could mean that the symbology at the very heart of the Christian church is inaccurate.
Greek text of the New Testament said that Jesus was stavron. Only that, no details, no information on how it looked like. So the text of the New Testament said that Jesus was suspended. In my mind, it's not crucifixion, it's suspension of corpses.
All words evolve over time. Nowadays, we see stauron as meaning crucifixion because of what's in the Bible, but actually originally it just meant to suspend, and it meant to suspend in a vast variety of ways, possibly on a stake, on a pale, on a tree. In one text, it's even used to describe a dog being spitted on a spear. It was a very broad word.
The possibility that a key part of the crucifixion story is incorrect is unthinkable to many in the church. But perhaps it helps explain one of the peculiarities of the modern Bible, why the cross is barely referenced.
The cross isn't really mentioned in the Bible, and therefore it's perfectly possible that Jesus was not crucified on a cross structure.
In an attempt to find the truth in the biblical story, Gunnar turned to the Codex Sinaiticus, the world's oldest complete Bible written in the 4th century AD. But in this manuscript, he found another mystery.
So if you go to Codex Sinaiticus, you will get one surprise. You have the death of Jesus. So you have Jesus suspended. And then it says that someone took a spear and he punched the side of Jesus. And Codex Sinaiticus have an addition. Jesus shouted out loud and died. He was killed by a Roman spear.
The modern Bible does mention Jesus being pierced by a Roman spear, but it only happens after Christ has already died on the cross. Why would a detail as crucial as this be left out?
I mean, isn't it a bit strange that for some reason this reference to a Roman spear being the cause of the death of Jesus is removed from later versions of the Bible?
Whether killed by a Roman spear or just suspended, Gunnar's research casts doubt over the whole crucifixion narrative. But today, Christian iconography is centered around the symbol of the cross, which surprisingly is not documented until centuries after the death of Jesus.
The symbol of the cross, it appears to be of a little later date.
The crucifixion actually doesn't appear in Christian art till about the 5th century. So that's 4 or 5 centuries after the event. From that point, that version is then adapted and changed across time by different groups.
What's also really surprising is religion's ability to splinter into different sects with radically opposing views. Something as central as the cross is even in dispute.
The standard Christian cross is called the Latin cross, but in the Eastern Church, they have a square cross, which is called the Greek cross to this day. And then you have Orthodox churches. It has not just the single bar across the middle, it's a 3-barred cross.
Although some Christian denominations disagree about the shape of the cross, others reject it completely.
There are parts of the Christian family and certain Christian sects who really take umbrage with the image of the cross. I think particularly of the Jehovah's Witnesses, who argue very strongly that the cross was a symbol that was introduced when the devil took hold of ecclesial authority.
Despite the disagreement, all the variations can be traced back to the Latin cross, 2 planks of wood stuck together at right angles, which appears to have roots in 4th century Jerusalem. According to Roman legend, it was in this city that the true cross was discovered. Archaeologist Ben Mantel is hunting for answers in Jerusalem's Old Town. Is this really the spot where Jesus died on a cross?
So, for the majority of the Christians of the world, this is it. This is the place of the crucifixion. The foundation of Christianity really is linked to this place right here.
According to legend, this church was built on the spot where Jesus' cross was discovered.
So the church is built in the 4th century by Helena, mother of Emperor Constantine.
As the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity, Constantine wanted to seize holy relics to bring power to his empire.
Constantine seconded his mother, Helena, in about the year 326 to go and find the site of Jesus' crucifixion.
Legend has it that Helena set out on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Once in the Holy Land, she was taken to the site where the locals claimed Jesus was crucified.
What she found there was a Roman temple. They'd built a temple to Roman gods on the site, but because she was the emperor's mother, she could have it removed. So excavations were carried out there, and they found various fragments of a cross.
Believers claim the wooden fragments were from the Latin cross used to crucify Jesus. A long, tall cross with a shorter crossbar towards the top. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was built on the spot where it was supposedly found. Today, the site attracts thousands of tourists and pilgrims, many coming to see the stone where Christ's dead body was apparently laid.
So this is the anointing stone. The body has to be taken off the cross, anointed with oil, and then it is covered in shrouds, and from here it goes into the burial cave. Pilgrims from all over the world will actually come and put their precious possessions and consecrate them on this rock.
This church claims that as well as being the site of the crucifixion, it's also the place of the resurrection. Deep within the church is a tiny sacred crypt where some believe this miracle happened.
This is the Chapel of the Angel, which is the first room where the rolling stone was rolled out. And the tradition is that this rock that you're seeing here is a fragment from the original rolling stone. And then the inner room has the stone bed where Jesus was laid. You can see a little bit of iconography, but of course, as a commemoration site, this is the place of the miracle. From here, Jesus was resurrected.
For many, this is enough to confirm the church as the spot where Jesus died.
So do I think that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is the place of the crucifixion? If you're asking me personally, without a shred of doubt.
Despite its fame and 1,700 years of tradition, some question this church's authenticity.
The Church of the Holy Sepulchre being the site of Jesus' crucifixion is really based on speculation. There is no direct evidence that Jesus was crucified at that particular site.
Disbelievers in the site's authenticity point to Jewish tradition which considers corpses impure. This means that in ancient Jerusalem, crucifixions and burials took place outside of the city limits. Yet some claim the Holy Sepulchre is inside the ancient city walls.
We know for a fact that Jews wouldn't be executed within the city. In other words, the church could not have been inside the city if it is built on the location of the crucifixion.
Part of the dilemma with the location of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is that its outer sections may have been within the walls of the city.
Although the city boundaries from the biblical era are unclear, a surprising event revealed something unexpected. In 1808, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was ravaged by fire.
The fire did reveal something. This hole here, and inside we can actually see that we're seeing a corner of a Jewish burial site. And based on the cutting techniques and based on the architectural style of this burial site, we can date it back to the times of Christ. In other words, I cannot say for a fact that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is the burial place of Jesus, but what I can say, without a shred of doubt, is that 2,000 years ago, Jews are buried here.
For this to have been a Jewish tomb at the time of Christ, it must have been outside of the city walls, and therefore could have been the site of the crucifixion after all. Yet despite the evidence, some scholars still have their doubts.
For me, the Holy Sepulchre has never quite rung true as the site for the crucifixion. Apart from anything else, it's just all a bit too convenient. The site of the crucifixion, the site of the tomb of Jesus, in exactly the same spot. I think most people who visited the Holy Sepulchre have had this sneaking feeling that it isn't the site of the crucifixion.
There is another possibility for a site where Jesus may have been crucified, and that is called Golgotha, which means the skull.
Meaning skull in Aramaic, many believe the name Golgotha is a clue, as the Bible describes Jesus being crucified on Skull Hill.
Since the 19th century, some Protestants have claimed that a skull-shaped hill just outside the Damascus Gate in Jerusalem is a more credible site for the crucifixion of Jesus. And there are some compelling reasons for that. I mean, for one, the situation is ideal. It's definitely outside the city walls.
Without solid evidence, the exact location of Christ's death will remain a mystery. Although the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is supposedly built on the spot where the cross was found, other archaeological evidence for crucifixion is near non-existent.
Today, we think of crucifixions as a very common execution during the Roman period. However, there's very little archaeological evidence we've ever uncovered.
According to the Roman-era Jewish historian Josephus, up to 500 people a day were crucified in the Jerusalem region. But despite this huge number, it's a mystery why such little archaeological evidence exists.
Archaeologically speaking, the evidence for crucifixion is just tiny. It is minuscule in comparison to the number of individuals that we have reason to believe suffered this fate.
Yet at Tel Aviv University, there lies a crucial clue to solving the mystery of this ancient execution technique: physical evidence of an actual historical crucifixion.
Whenever I pull out the box from the safe, I'm getting excited. It's one of the rare finds that I've ever encountered.
Discovered in 1968, this heel still has the nail stuck in the bone. Could this relic solve one of the world's greatest mysteries? Did Christ die on the cross? Professor Israel Hershkovitz has been studying this unique piece of evidence for decades and has dated it back to the time of Christ.
This is the only evidence that we have for crucifixion. What we see here actually is the heel bone. It's almost a complete heel bone, and we see an iron nail actually running and penetrating from the side of the heel bone, coming out from the opposite side.
Archaeologists really put these remains through the ringer and conclusively have decided that this is an example of crucifixion. And it's stunningly important because it does prove that crucifixion was practiced during this time period in the Roman Empire.
Since its discovery in 1968 in an ancient Jewish crypt, only a handful of remains from other suspected crucifixion victims have been found, but none have stood up to the scrutiny of this heel bone.
The extraordinary thing about the discovery was that it has a bone with a nail still going through it. This was the first time this had ever been discovered, and it proves, at least, that the Romans did crucify with nails.
Before this incredible find, historians were under the impression that most crucifixion victims weren't permitted a proper burial. It was thought their bodies were either left to rot where they hung or were buried in a shallow grave. If that were the case, it would contradict the Bible's claim that Jesus' body was placed in a tomb. Yet this bone was found in an ossuary, in an ancient Jewish crypt.
We know that the name of the deceased, Yohanan, the name was engraved on the side of the ossuary in a Hebrew letter that we can even read today.
Since Yohanan was granted funeral rights, it proves that a part of the Bible's crucifixion story could be true, that Jesus was placed in a tomb after his body was removed from the cross.
Yohanan and his bones are unbelievably important for us because not only was he crucified by the Romans, but he was crucified by the Romans in the same place as Jesus, in the same century as Jesus.
This find in Jerusalem is critically important in our consideration of whether the story of Jesus that we read in the Bible could have been true. They're both prominent Jews. They were given proper burials. So it's not as if this case of Jesus is just an anomaly.
This bone of Johanan could finally tell us what really happened that day to Jesus Christ.
Analysis of the heel reveals another clue: the remains of a piece of wood.
One particularly gruesome detail is that there appears to be a small piece of wood under the head of the nail. That would have stopped the person from wriggling free off the cross.
The piece of the wood that was actually lying between the head of the nail and the surface of the heel was made of an olive tree. It's interesting because according to the tradition, the cross was made of olive tree.
Historical accounts of crucifixion offer no conclusive answer for the type of wood used. But when fragments of the cross supposedly found by Helena in the 4th century were tested, they were found to be olive wood, leading to modern-day theories that this wood was used for crucifixions. While Yohanan's bone supports this theory, for Professor Hershkovitz, it strikes a blow to the possibility that Jesus died on a Latin cross.
Olive tree, as we all know, doesn't have a full body of a tree. It's a trunk. It's all penetrated and distorted and so on. And you cannot create a long log from an olive tree.
The Latin cross is made from huge wooden planks, the type that's nearly impossible to produce from olive wood.
One thing that's really important to consider, which is easy to forget, is that wood of a sufficient size to support a human body would have been in scarce supply in the region of the Holy Land.
So if Christ was not crucified on a tall Latin cross, what actually happened on that day?
I don't think that it was a T-shaped cross. I mean, it really doesn't make sense, not from the evidence that we have and not from simple anatomic logic.
To determine how Jesus was hung on the cross, Professor Hershkovitz has studied artworks of the crucifixion. He believes the position of the body in relation to the crossbar depicted in many portraits makes the Latin cross an impossibility.
Usually the crossbar was placed according to all reconstructions against the neck.
While many paintings depict Christ's hands nailed to the front of the cross, Professor Hershkovitz believed this would not have supported the weight of his body for the entire crucifixion. Therefore, he believes Jesus' arms must have been positioned behind the crossbar.
The hands are running actually behind the crossbar, so try to do it. You see, it's impossible. He needs to twist the whole body, and it's still impossible. I have to take it down, very down, almost to the center of the back over here, for him to be able actually to hold the crossbar from the opposite side. And nobody would say that this is the way the Roman crucified people.
Is this the final nail in the coffin for the Latin cross? Perhaps another shape could unravel this enigma.
I believe that the only cross that makes sense and follow the evidence, the hard evidence, is the X-shaped cross. Now, as another example, let's say it was an X-shaped cross. In an X-shaped cross, put your hand and put the palm of the hand at the back. You see, this is the way he holds the X-shaped cross.
For many, the simplicity of the X-shaped cross makes it a viable solution for the crucifixion mystery.
I think that the theory that by using smaller pieces of wood affixed together in an X shape, rather than the big long pole, actually makes a lot of sense. You know, the fact is you can't conjure natural resources out of thin air.
The X-shaped cross is perfectly credible. It may be that people were nailed to a tree in an X shape, or there were two pieces of wood that just happened to be attached to each other and they were just used because it suited the purpose.
Astonishingly, historical records show that the X-shaped cross has been used in crucifixions. One of Jesus' disciples, Andrew, the patron saint of Scotland, was crucified in this way. The X shape is remembered today on the country's flag. But if Jesus was crucified in this way, why is the most fundamental symbol of Christianity a Latin cross and not an X? Maybe the oldest known depiction of the death of Christ, found in Rome, can help solve the mystery.
The earliest record of Jesus being crucified is most likely the Alexamenus graffito. Now, this was an etching on the edge of the Palatine Hill, and the etching depicts a crucifixion victim with the head of a donkey and a young worshipper at the bottom with the inscription, "Alex worships his God." Now, this was clearly a kind of mockery.
This graffiti dates back to 200 AD, and at this point in time, Christianity was still not a religion to be respected in Rome.
It shows that at that date, there were many people who ridiculed Jesus. They didn't see him as this great and important figure. They were poking fun by putting a donkey's head on him. But in Rome, where people really did know what crucifixions looked like, they depict it with a T-shaped cross.
This graffiti appears to show Jesus being crucified on a shape very close to the Latin cross.
The graffiti from Italy provides pretty compelling evidence that Christ probably was hung on some form of cross. Because this is an insult, this is a parody. Why include that detail if it's simply not true?
This is a political statement from its time, but it also is a really interesting reinforcement of the story of the crucifixion that we read in the Bible.
Does this graffiti finally prove that Jesus died on the Latin cross? While many scholars need more conclusive evidence, some point to a passage in the crucifixion story which could be backed up by science.
There is one thing in the Bible that could help to identify the time and place of the crucifixion, and that's an earthquake.
Like so much of what is written in the Bible, it's very hard to disentangle hard fact from faith. But one piece of that story of Jesus' crucifixion absolutely could have been true. And that is the report of an earthquake at the time Jesus died. As the Bible tells it, the curtain in the temple was rent in two and the earth shook.
Now, we know in the Bible story that as Jesus died on the cross, that the ground shook. And this is undoubtedly an area of huge seismic activity. So it's not beyond the realms that we may have had an earthquake at that time.
The Dead Sea, Israel. Located about 20 miles east of Jerusalem, it acts as a geological record of the region. Geologist Shmuel Marco is hunting for evidence of this crucifixion quake.
The Dead Sea, for us geologists, is a history book. It's been here for ages, millions of years. And the biblical story of Jesus are included in this time. At the time of the crucifixion, there was a strong earthquake. So the earthquake should be recorded in these sediments.
The idea of an earthquake shaking ancient Jerusalem is not as bizarre as it may sound. In the last 1,000 years, this region has been hit by 12 major quakes.
The reason that this is an earthquake country is that this particular place is a boundary between two tectonic plates. Here on the west, we have the Sinai plate, and on the east, we have the Arabian plates. They are held together at the boundary by the friction. And any time that the forces overcome the friction, we see a jump. And this is an earthquake.
When an earthquake strikes, it permanently changes the geology of the seabed.
When the bottom of the lake shakes, there are very fine layers that are distorted and disturbed, and we see this disturbance in the sediments, and we identify earthquakes.
Normally, these historic records are hidden beneath the waves. Yet, over the last half-century, the Dead Sea has been slowly receding, giving up its secrets.
As the Dead Sea has been receding, some of the evidence for past earthquakes has been revealed.
Astonishingly, layers of rock which made up the seabed when Jesus was crucified have been exposed again.
So we can find layers which correlate in time to the same period that Jesus lived.
The geological records of the Dead Sea prove an earthquake occurred within 5 years of the biblical account of the crucifixion.
And there was an earthquake which was documented by the sediments of the Dead Sea. It could very well be the earthquake which is described in the Bible.
For some, this is proof that at least part of the story lays in fact, not fiction.
The stratification now being revealed by the receding Dead Sea proves that there was an earthquake and that fits in with the story of Jesus' crucifixion.
From an archaeological standpoint, this sort of geological evidence is, I would say, pretty much as good as we're going to get in terms of verifying the crucifixion.
Yet some scholars are less convinced.
The earthquake theory, though, has to be put into context, which is that there are regular earthquakes in that part of the world, and the descriptions of the crucifixion in the Bible are not history. So the descriptions of the earthquake are symbolic. They're about the destruction of the sacred edifice of the holiness, a metaphor for Christ's body. They're all sorts of things, but they're not a geological event.
I personally wouldn't invest too much into the earthquake. Although it's reported and it does seem to have some scientific verification, as a writer, the earth is quaking because world history is about to change because of this extinction-level event of the crucifixion of Jesus.
Despite the skepticism, the geology of the Dead Sea does prove an earthquake struck around the same time as the biblical story. But while many scholars try to prove the events of the Holy Book, there are tales of Christ surviving the crucifixion which even include a Cold War conspiracy to hide the truth behind his death.
Inevitably, with a story as big as the story of Jesus, there have always been multiple versions of it. And one strand that has emerged is the idea that Jesus didn't die at the crucifixion and that he survived.
There have been a lot of speculators as to alternative outcomes for Jesus, saying that he had survived the crucifixion. One called the Jesus Scroll postulated that Jesus actually retreated to this mountainside retreat above the Dead Sea.
The Jesus Scroll story involves a claim that one of the Dead Sea Scrolls proved that Jesus survived the crucifixion, living to old age.
The Dead Sea Scrolls are a set of ancient texts, with some providing an alternate theory on the beginnings of Christianity. Some claim one of these manuscripts, known as the Jesus Scroll, was never released to the public. A proclamation first made by Australian journalist Donovan Joyce.
The astonishing claim made by Donovan Joyce is that he was at Tel Aviv airport in 1964, and an archaeologist begged him to take this scroll, which proved that Jesus had survived the crucifixion, take it to the West and share the story. Now, Donovan Joyce refused to do this. What Joyce claims is that this archaeologist, disgruntled, then flew to Moscow and tried to sell it to the Soviet Union so that they could prove to the world that Christianity was a lie.
If Joyce's story is to be believed, the scroll, signed by Jesus himself, fell into the hands of the Soviets. To this day, the country has not released any details of what the scroll described. Apparently, it tells of Jesus living to the age of 80 and fighting the Romans at the legendary Battle of Masada.
The Siege of Masada is one of the great tales that we have in Western civilization. And this idea that Jesus was present at Masada, that's a really titillating tale.
Masada, Israel. Nearly 40 miles southeast of Jerusalem, it's one of the ancient world's greatest forts.
So the year is 73 AD, and the final place of refuge for the last of the Jewish rebels is down by the Dead Sea in the Judean desert on a mountain called Masada.
Local historian Gideon Hadass is investigating the claim that this is where Jesus died.
We are on top of Masada. Masada is very high from the surroundings, as you can see all around. It's a cliff by itself, and it's very impressive. 10,000 Roman soldiers were around Masada, and there was about 900 Jews on the mountain. If Jesus was here, he died here.
Legend says that after laying siege to the mountain fortress for over 4 months, the Romans were finally at a point of breakthrough. Knowing their time was up, the Jewish zealots, and maybe Jesus, made a pact.
The commander of the fortress gave 2 speeches to encourage the people to kill themselves, to stay free, not to enslave by the Romans, and they decided to kill themselves.
If the Jesus Scroll is to be believed, this is where Christ died, having ended his own life. If proven, this story would cause shockwaves around the world. But some believe the Jesus Scroll suggests much more.
If the Jesus Scroll is true, then Jesus wasn't crucified, he wasn't resurrected, therefore he wasn't the Son of God. Therefore Christianity rests on a lie, because Jesus lived to an old age and took his own life.
Today, the Jesus Scroll is one of the many stories of Christ surviving the crucifixion. Unless one theory is proven to be true, scholars are left debating the credibility of the event at the heart of Christianity.
If something would come about today in our day and age that will actually suggest that Jesus never died on the cross, that will be a game changer.
While the church remains adamant that Jesus was crucified, skeptics still question the truth behind the cross.
As much as the cross means to people, and as much as it informs ancient and modern Christian iconography, it's entirely possible that our portrayal of the cross may be something which has been informed by something other than verifiable fact.
We know that the Bible is not history, it's memory. So does it matter exactly how individuals were crucified? We have in our mind a certain idea of a lowercase t that has reverberated through millennia in Western civilization, in literature and art. But looking at the likelihood that that was the case against what we know about the climate, the geography, the natural resources that were available at the time really is food for thought.
But for some, the truth is lost forever.
Historically, there is very rarely smoke without fire. It is likely that in the early 1st century AD, a Jewish man called Jesus was crucified by the Romans. But why he was executed and the way in which he was executed will probably forever be lost to us.
Even if we did find evidence that Jesus did not die on the cross, there are far too many people who would not engage with that possibility, who would feel that the evidence was planted, it's misinterpreted, misunderstood.
In the New Testament, there are no real descriptions how Jesus was crucified. He didn't leave any written information, and the picture of Jesus being crucified on a T-shaped cross appeared first in the 5th or the 6th century AD, more than 500 years after Jesus was crucified. So the people who first painted Jesus on the cross had no idea whatsoever how Jesus was crucified.
But for the Christian church, perhaps the stakes are too high.
It's doubtful that we'll ever know the truth about the death of Jesus because a lot of very powerful people seem to want to keep this information from us, particularly those around the Vatican.
It's certainly not in the interests of the Vatican to open up a debate on the crucifixion, to think about other alternatives. There is no other alternative as far as the Vatican is concerned.
Yet the faithful hold fast to their beliefs.
So do I believe in the crucifixion? I do, because I am a priest. It doesn't matter exactly the way Jesus died. The important thing was that Jesus died. He gave his life for me. That's the message of the church.